So as of filming this video, the official rules for the old world are not out yet. But we have seen a lot of previews, enough to make me think that Cavalry is going to be really strong in the old world. That means whether you play Bretonnia, Empire, or God forbid some kind of elf, you're probably painting a lot of horses. This guide is going to walk you through 5 different ways to paint 5 different tones of horse. And then a little bit on the end, I'll go over how I paint some of these bardings, horseshoes, stuff like that. So saddle up and let's explore how to paint Warhammer horses quickly, but still make them look great. So the first flesh tone I want to talk about is a nice bay color for a horse. And pure Gorgrunta fur is a little bit too red, and of course snakebite leather is just brown. So what we're going to do is mix 2 parts snakebite leather and 1 part Gorgrunta fur to get a nice bay color. So standard practice how I deal with things I paint with contrast is I prime with black, then I do another layer with gray sear, and then a very top layer hitting only the highest parts of the model with Wraithbone, and then I dry brush with the white before I start painting. You can see the color giving a nice reddish brown here. The cool thing about this is you can change up your mixture ratios and get a little bit of variation in your horses. You know, I did 2 parts snakebite, 1 part Gorgrunta. Maybe next time you do 50-50. Maybe even try 2 parts Gorgrunta, 1 part snakebite leather, see what that gives you. It will still give you a flesh that's reddish brown, but will add a little bit of variation to your unit. So standard practice for me when I'm using these contrast paints, don't get too much on your brush. We don't want it to pull in places where we don't want. It does dry fast, so you have to stay on top of it. Try to pull the brush in only one direction, helps a lot. Just these real basic tips with contrast paints to get them to looking as good as they can. Your first few times might come out a little splotchy, a little bit not what you want, but with a little bit of practice you can get some really good results with these contrast paints. I'm overall really impressed with them. By not getting the paint too thick, it's really only pulling in the deep recesses, and we get, you know, a real nice detail on, you know, the eyes, the nose, the details of the horse face. Just be very careful not to get onto the leather. It's not the worst thing in the world if you do. It just means you gotta do a little cleanup before you can paint that leather, which will increase the amount of time it takes to paint the model. Getting underneath these models can be a real pain, especially if they're already attached to the base. My best advice for you is to do the best you can. Really, for all the undersides, as long as you get a good base color down, that's probably good enough. It's going to look right in the shadows. And for a lot of those really hard to reach areas, they're never going to be visible anyways. Once your skin's done, we're going to move on to doing the tail, and we're just going to do a layer of contrast black Templar. Black is a really safe color for a horse's tail, and the contrast paint's going to work really well on these various strands here. To add more variation, you can mix in shades of your brown with the black to get some slightly different hair colors, and we'll go over more of that on some of the other tutorials in this video. Once we have the base layer for our tail done and it's dry, we're just going to do a quick dry brush of Dawnstone, also from GW. And once that's dry, we can move on from the flesh on this horse and go about painting the barding. Next, I'm going to do a very traditional black horse, and we're going to start with our Black Templar contrast paints. This is probably the easiest color to paint. We just have to be careful not to make things too dark. But to start with, we just have our traditional zenithal coating, and then we're giving everything on this flesh a nice thin layer of this black contrast paint. Just like with the lighter colors, we want to be careful to not let it pool, because when it pools, our details are going to show up less than they would otherwise. The tail we're going to do in a very traditional black as well, but we're going to go back through and line it up in these next steps. Once the model is completely coated and we're happy with it, we're going to let it dry, and then we're going to do a dry brush on the flesh of Eshin Gray. I know a big reason people like contrast paints is to not have to do these steps, but this Black Templar is just so dark. Unless you're really close, the details on the horse's legs, hair, etc. is just not gonna stand out. So we're just gonna enhance the whole look of this horse just by doing a nice dry brush anywhere there's flesh. Just pop out these details a little bit. And now with the same color, I'm just going to go back through the model with a more detailed brush and just do some edge highlighting on some of the more prominent features of the horse. Features like the ears, the nose, nostrils, etc., just to make them pop out a little bit more on the model. Last but not least here, we're just going to pick out some spots on the tail with some Dawnstone, using a dry brush once again. This just helps the hair on the horse look different than the rest of his body, to break up some monotony. Barring that, this horse is ready for a rider. So now we're doing a dun colored horse, and we're doing it with a mix of Agaros Dunes and Snakebite Leather. For the horse in this video, I think I mix it around 50-50 for both, but just like with the bay horse, you can mix up the ratio of these paints to slightly change the color of your horse and add some variety to your units. And I know I harp on this a lot, I sound like a broken record, but I really do think these subtle variations are key to making units look really great on the tabletop. If every horse is painted the exact same or the exact shade, it just looks very robotic. So I should probably also add that your traditional war horse would be a destrier, and a destrier would not come in this dun color we're doing here. This kind of color horse was more common, say, in the Middle East and in Africa, and in Arabic armies, rather than, you know, your typical European war horse. But at the same time, this is not the real world. Do what you want. I think it's a fun color. It adds some variety. And technically, the Bretonnian horses are descended from elven horses, you know, not European destriers. So who knows, man? Just have fun. Another quick tip for when you're doing this kind of ratios, these color mixtures that you might change up every now and then, make sure you get enough paint the first time around so you only have to do one coat, and that way you don't have to worry about trying to match the rest of the tone of the horse. We'll let that paint dry, and then we're going to do the tail. For this dun horse, we're going with pure Cygor brown. This is a really dark brown color. I really like it for the tails on dun horses. It's also good to mix for different tails. Say if you're doing a black horse, mix the black contrast with this brown here for their tails, or something similar, you know, to just add a little bit of variation from the skin tone. Cygor also works as a color you can do the flesh of horses with, but it would be a very dark brown and probably something you want to use in, you know, relative moderation. Because the brown's so dark, even as a contrast, we're going to follow that up after it dries with a dry brush of Night Quester Flesh. And once that's done, we have another horse with finished flesh. So now we're doing a white horse, and we're going to start with the Celestra Gray, and we're just going to get a base coat all over. Of the horses shown in these videos, this white horse will be the hardest one to paint because we are not making use of any contrast or shading here. We're just going to build up on layers. This gray serves as our bottommost layer, and then we're going to build up to lighter and lighter colors from there. Prime coat is light, like it is in this horse example. Take special care to make sure you cover this layer completely. We don't want a lighter color shining underneath this gray. It's going to ruin the layering of the model. So now we want to build up on these layers. We're using some Utherwong Gray. And like I'm sure you've seen in many other tutorials, we want to leave the darker gray in the darkest recesses. We don't want to cover that. We just want to hit the higher points with this lighter gray that's almost a white, but not quite. A fairly effective tip here is to use the side of your brush rather than the point to make sure you don't get into any dark crevices. But mostly just take your time. You know, it just comes with practice. And finally, I'm using this Trooper White just for the highest of highlights on the ears, you know, the biggest tendons on his leg, etc. This will just help add depth and definition to the model and make sure the details stand out where they should. If you're uncomfortable with this kind of highlighting, or you just don't have the time for it, you could also do this with a dry brush as well. And once that's done, you have another horse whose flesh is done. Back to the basics for this last horse, we're doing a layer of contrast wildwood. This will give the horse a dark brown, but not quite as dark as Cygor brown, which I feel is often too dark. For a pure brown horse, snakebite leather is also a really good choice, but that's also a really good choice to do the leather on the barding on the comparison. So I tend not to do a lot of horses in pure snakebite. I also find, for whatever reason, snakebite leather is one of the GW colors most vulnerable to things like pooling, getting those weird coffee stains on your contrast paints. So I don't like doing large swaths of a model with just that color, and I wouldn't recommend it unless you're very, very, very careful. It does give a nice brown though. If you do use that color for the flesh, as far as the leather on the rest of the horse goes, Agarose Dunes is a nice light leather color that I also like a lot. This one is really easy to paint because it's so simple, and I think gives a really good color for a destrier horse. For the tail, I'm going to mix the wildwood with this black Templar, just to give us a slightly different tone that doesn't match the skin for the tail. Cygor brown would have also been a pretty good choice here. And then to finish the flesh on this horse, I'm just taking some Dawnstone to highlight the tail. A light brown would have worked here too, just make that tail sound out more so all those details don't all blend together. Hooves are very simple. We're just going to use our contrast black Templar to get the actual hoof, and then you'll use some kind of darker metallic to do the horseshoe, which I'll show you a little later in the video when I do metallics. The order in which I do things on this model is a little bit messed up because I'm doing this with a tutorial in mind, but generally I recommend doing the flesh of the horse, the fur, the coat of the horse before doing the hooves. Do the hooves and the feet last. And then once you get this layer on his feet on, you're going to use a wash, and the wash might depend on what color you painted the horse, but use some kind of wash to help blend in the black of the hoof with the fur of the rest of the horse. A nice Nuln Oil or Agrex Earthshade wash is also pretty nice for the horseshoes once you have those painted. As simple as that. Alright, the first method I'm going to show you for doing the leather on these horses is just a real simple layer of snakebite leather. Normally I wouldn't recommend doing the leather until one of the last steps after you have the main colors of the cloth of the horse painted, the comparison, and then I do the leather, but it's just worked out this way because I'm doing a tutorial. But this method itself is really simple. Just the one layer of snakebite leather works really good here. If you use snakebite leather for the flesh of the horse, you could do Agros Dunes here. That's an alternative color. It also looks pretty good. But basically, all you gotta do is make sure all your leather bits are painted. And then, obviously, if the rest of the horse is painted too, you might use a wash to try to blend a little bit the edges around the leather and the cloth. Usually just a little thin layer of Nuln Oil works well there. But honestly, this is really simple and it gets really good results. If you get a little bit on those shields there, it's not a big deal. They'll cover up easy. Obviously, if you're doing this for real, the cloth on the horse is probably painted, so you're going to be real careful there. Because I'm doing this first, I don't have to be as careful. But ultimately, it's easier to paint the leather on top of the cloth than to go back and do the cloth underneath the leather. The leather around the head can be a little tricky, but just take your time. We'll go back and fix up those metal bits later, so go ahead and just cover the whole thing. Practice makes perfect, but you know, slow and steady, small brush, you got this. And that's pretty much it for this method. Very simple, but there's one more method of doing these leather straps that I kind of want to share that's really easy to do, and I think gets really good results. This second method for leather is a bit more time consuming, but it's still very lazy. We start with a layer of scrag brown. Be sure to cover the whole model with this base coat, avoiding getting any on your comparison if you've already painted that bit, and just give a nice even base coat across the model. With this first layer, it's going to seem really bright and really not right, but bear with me, we're going to make this look pretty good. Once this coat is done, let it dry for a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next step. Once that layer is completely dry, we're going to hit it with the sepia wash all over. And then once that coat's dry, we're going to add 2 more coats onto it. After 3 coats of this, you're going to get a nice worn leather effect that looks really good for the amount of effort you put into it. A little more, well, a lot more time consuming than just doing the contrast, but I really like how this one turns out. So right now in this video, I am adding my third and final coat. You can see how different this is compared to where we first started and how much of a nice effect this has, especially around the ridges or anywhere there's some kind of detailing. And once that third layer is dry, we're going to go back in with the pure scrag brown and just do some edge highlighting to, the most detailed upraised areas. This is, semi-optional. The layers of wash do a pretty good job of adding contrast to this before we do any highlighting. Plus, we're going to go back and do the metal bits later, so there's going to be plenty of interest in this leather. But I do think doing a little bit of highlighting just helps make it pop even more so. But yeah, those are the two methods I use to do the leather parts of these horses. It looks really great when you get the rest of the horse painted up, and when you get these metal bits highlighted out. As far as saddles go, I like to use a different color leather than I did the rest of the horse, just for a little bit of contrast, a little bit of variety for interest, and I often go to Cygor brown. There's really not much to it, just get a nice even coat of whatever color you choose, and make sure you don't forget the strap tying it to the horse around the belly. To further enhance the leather, this is what I do for the metal bits. I'm using Iron Hand steel here. But really, there's a lot of choices. Lead Belcher is good too. Any of the darker metallics, we don't want to go too light because then it looks more like silver when we're aiming to get more of an iron metal here. And we're just going to very carefully pick out these metal details, the round parts on the leather bits of the horse, the buckles of the leather straps, etc. The shields on the horse, I kind of do depending on the horse, on what the colors of the heraldry are. Sometimes I do them silver, sometimes I do them gold, sometimes I do it in the heraldry colors. It's really just, I take each knight one at a time and do what I think looks best. One of the best parts about Bretonnia is you're better served off if not all the knights look the same, so you don't have to paint a very uniform theme. Don't forget to do the barding, the chainmail underneath the comparison, and this all looks a little bit better with a little bit of wash of Nuln oil on top of it. Although not pictured here, it's also really good to do the horseshoes with this color, and then you could use a wash of Nuln oil to blend it more in with the foot. Or hoof, you know what I mean. Not much to how I do teeth. I just like to do a little layer of Ushabti bone, being very careful not to get it on his lips, his skin, his metal bit within his mouth. We just want to get a nice layer on his teeth, and then we're going to follow that up with a layer of Agrek's Earthshade. One thing we can always add if we choose is socks to a horse. I'm starting with Uthwan Grey. And here we are just going to very carefully make a few lines, little dabs, across the feet of the horse, but not onto the actual hoof. If you want things to look realistic, a real life horse that does have socks, these socks are often not uniform. On one foot, the sock may be bigger than the other, and they might have one sock, they might have two, they might have three, they don't always have four. So as you go through these models, on the ones you're adding sock to, just have fun with it, and just, you don't have to make them match each other through the horse. I'm going to follow up on that layer with some Screaming Skull. And again, I'm going to go around the feet. This is just to add more than one tone of hair to the sock, just to make it more visually appealing, more interesting than what we had before. And that's really all there is to socks. Bretonnian horses are pretty covered up, so I don't really bother doing like spots, on the forehead or so. But if you were doing like an Empire or High Elves or Wood Elves, where you might have a more open horse without so much cloth on them and you want to add a spot in the forehead, I'd basically use the same colors, the same methods to give little blemishes on his head or in different parts of his body, whatever you want to do. And that concludes the last little thing I'm showing today. Besides the actual color of the cloth, that's everything to do with the horse. Combine these all together and you're going to end up getting a very nice knight. So here is what one of the tutorial horses I was using in this video looks when fully painted up. Personally, I like spending a lot of time on my knights, and so I like to get through my horses as fast as I can, but I want to make sure they look good for the tabletop. I hope these tricks that I showed you help do it for you as well. And as always, thanks for watching.